Hello all, and welcome to the July Patch Tuesday webcast. We will begin in just a few short moments, but before you do, I'd like to remind everybody that they are currently in listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask the panelists questions at any time, and we will get to them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi. A warm welcome to everyone today on the July Patch Tuesday webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today to understand what we believe to be the most important patches to prioritize this month. And as usual, I have two experts in my team joining us today. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, thanks, Rob. Everyone, John Cassell, Senior Solutions Architect with Syxsense. I'm based in currently not so sunny California. I've been working in IT for many years, specializing in desktop and server operations. And at Syxsense, I dabble in pre-sales, customer onboarding, and community management.
Fantastic, John, thank you. And Peter.
Thanks there, Rob. Hi, everybody. My name is Peter. I'm based in the UK, where it's never really very sunny. I've worked for Syxsense as a pre-sales consultant for 5 years. Prior to my current role, I worked for an oil company where I managed a tool that at the time was called Landesk. The tool was used to manage around 4,500 devices. I used the tool for general asset management, software deployment, and of course, patch management.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Peter. And once again, my name is Rob Brown. I'm the Director of Services from our UK head office. My team is responsible for the security solutions that we deliver to our clients, one of those being patch management. And over the last 15 or so years, we've deployed over 100 million patches. So welcome. So just like last time, I'd like to provide some feedback that we had from you who sent through comments and chats to us. I just want to clarify a few things and to pick up on some of the great suggestions we had as how we can improve these webcasts going forward. The first one I'd like to clarify, the CVEs that we mention in these webcasts aren't actually patches. The CVE is a description of a vulnerability. And what Microsoft do is they publish the CVEs, and those CVEs can be remediated by a single patch. So a single patch that has a KB and an extension file. Now, you can actually have many vulnerabilities remediated by a single patch. And that's what we call a cumulative update. Obviously, the more patches, the more vulnerabilities that are remediated by the patch makes the patch much larger, and that's why we're talking about the size of this Patch Tuesday as well as last Patch Tuesday. If it's massive because there are so many CVEs remediated, means there's more files within the patches themselves. We also were asked if you could send in your questions if you're not able to attend, if you're in a different time zone. Absolutely, you can. If you put them into the chat or via the web, as we go to the website, I'll show you where you can talk to us, send in your questions even ahead of time, and we will actually answer them on this webcast. This is recorded, and you'll get a copy at the very end. We also asked if we could include some Mac and Linux, and that was from last month. And yes, we have a few slides for Mac and Linux, and we've put those right at the very end of the slide deck. So if you're here for Patch Tuesday, there will be some Mac and Linux just after that. And a very interesting question, what testing do we do before recommending the patches to you in this webcast? And that's a great question, because one of the departments that we have is the creation of content that we publish to our own toolset. So we have a patch management toolset, and the content that comes from Microsoft and third parties is actually collected by us and uploaded to that platform. And we actually test the patches prior to uploading to that platform. Now, what's important is that if we have an issue in the test, of course, this is a virtual environment that we're testing. it won't get added to that platform. But also, we won't let that knowledge not go unnoticed. We will bring it to you on this webcast. So if we had seen issues previously with any patches that we've uploaded, we would have a slide just for that, to mention that this patch, we have found issues. It doesn't mean you're going to, it means that we have seen an issue, such as a blue screen of death, an unexpected reboot, or some user interruption that we feel we should protect you from your users, so that they're able to keep working. So if we see that, we will have a slide. If there's no slide, it means we haven't seen any of those issues. So I hope I've got those clarified for you. But please send any questions that you have in addition to any of those. So let's look at the release cadence of this month. So earlier on this month, we had 6 non-security Office updates. And those Office updates were from Office 2013 and 2016. And they were non-security, which means that they were only enhancing or providing UI changes to those Office platforms. And yesterday, we had 123 security fixes. Now, if you were with us last month, you'll know that it was the largest Patch Tuesday in history, and I think this maybe is the second largest Patch Tuesday in history. We had 123 security fixes, and there's a few very important ones in there that we really should bring to your attention. Now, the .NET Framework is the 3rd Patch Tuesday of the month. So Office Updates is in the 1st Tuesday, security in the 2nd Tuesday. .NET Framework is now restored to the 3rd Tuesday of every month. And those will typically be non-security updates as well. Now, since last Patch Tuesday, we've had 9 out-of-band or 0-day vulnerabilities. And we're just going to quickly touch on those now because they are very important, especially with users now working from home. So last month, we had 9 KBs that were cumulative from Windows 8.1, Windows 10, and Windows Server 2012. And the patches themselves resolved a bug in the printing architecture that would cause applications that you were using to print to crash, or the print spooler on the system, if it was the server, to crash. Now, what's interesting is that Microsoft didn't know exactly which hardware vendors or virtual, because there's a lot of people that print to PDF now, which vendors were impacted. And in particular to this vulnerability, when you cause an application to crash, it leaves the surface area, the vector, to actually inject some code to leave your ransomware or your virus or your data theft. So anything that causes a crash or anything to close unexpectedly is actually an entry point for viruses of this kind. And we highly recommend that this be included if you haven't already deployed it. So we also have some third-party updates for your attention as well. This isn't just a Microsoft third-party, because there are in fact some third parties released with the Microsoft Patch Tuesday. So John, you've actually prepared some details for us on that. Would you like to tell us what you've been researching?
Absolutely, thanks, Rob. Just want to highlight the third-party patches, since they are, of course, just as important to remedy potential vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned on previous webinars, and I'll continue to, within Windows operating systems specifically, only 20% of those vulnerabilities really lie with Microsoft. 80% of those lie with all of the other third-party vendors, of course. Since last month, additional updates have been released, of course, to resolve those major vulnerabilities. And to highlight a few, of course, Zoom, very popular at the current moment with the current climate. A lot of organizations sending devices home, and so huge influx of teleconferencing. They did address a 0-day vulnerability earlier this month that allowed for remote code execution only on older operating systems, though, Windows 7 and the older OS types, but still very important to prioritize. The client update to version 5.1.3 was released on July 10th. It should be noted that there is no severity rating associated with the vulnerability, but very important to prioritize if you're using Zoom. Chrome released version 84 just yesterday, actually, for Windows, Mac, and Linux versions. This update included a critical fix regarding a heap buffer overflow in background fetch, as well as a number of high, medium, and low severity fixes like normal, ranging from information leakage to insufficient data validation in web UI. Both Mozilla Firefox and Thunderbird were patched for some moderate and high severity vulnerabilities, also pretty usual. Firefox version 78.0.2 included moderate fixes, as well as resolving some data issues in certain view modes, and an issue with opening certain external applications. So you'll want to get that resolved. Thunderbird version 68.10 resolved chat and calendar issues, as well as a number of high severity bugs in memory corruption, use after free flaws. Wireshark, typically used by many administrators for packet sniffing and for detecting traffic, version 3.2.5 was released at the beginning of the month, resolving a high severity flaw involving a potential infinite loop. This version also fixes a lot of other bugs in decryption support and file imports. Last but not least, there are clearly other additional products, none that really have a particular severity to highlight, but just to highlight a few of these other updates that were released within the last month, since last Patch Tuesday, including Adobe Flash Player, Cisco WebEx, Microsoft Edge, Skype, Dropbox, Notepad++, WinRAR, PuTTY, Snagit, and VLC Media Player, all of which have had certain severity vulnerabilities over the years. None of these happen to be prioritized with a higher rating, but should still be prioritized in terms of getting those updates out, because of course all of them are going to have some fixes. So to remind all administrators, as always, include the third-party patching in your patch management process.
Thank you, John. That's amazing. Yeah, a lot of clients we speak with don't realize just how many vulnerabilities there are in third parties, and actually that's almost the go-to attack surface for someone that wants to attack a system. Don't always go to the OS, but they go to something running on the OS. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so this is how we prioritize Patch Tuesday at Syxsense. We use 6 factors to determine the overall priority that we recommend on our website. The first one is the vendor severity, and that ranges from critical, important, all the way to low and NA. And the CVSS score, which is the independently assigned score for the vulnerability based on multi-factors. And if you joined us last month, you would have seen Peter did an excellent slide deck on explaining how the CVSS score is used to rank a vulnerability based on actual vectors that make the vulnerability easy or more difficult to expose. So it's more real life in this way. We also used weaponized vulnerabilities as a way of prioritizing our recommendation. Weaponized vulnerabilities means that we've learned that a particular vulnerability is being used to actively exploit a system. It could be a ransomware attack, it could be denial of service attack. A vulnerability exists that needs a patch in order to stop that weaponized vulnerability from being used. We use this to prioritize our patches. And next to weaponized vulnerabilities, almost as important is whether the vulnerability is public aware. Now, these come via bug bounty programs generally, but if a vulnerability or a method to expose that environment is made public aware, it doesn't take long for your fingers to do the talking and to find ways in which hackers would potentially use those vulnerabilities to expose your environment. Now, public aware means that code exists, or that mechanism to find the exploit exists. The time between it being public and weaponized can sometimes be very short. So if you have a public aware vulnerability, potentially in this Patch Tuesday, it absolutely needs to be prioritized. You need to start deploying it straight away. Now, the only thing to help us when we're prioritizing our patches is our countermeasures. Countermeasures exist in two types. One is a mitigation meaning that you have something on your system that protects you. Could be an advanced firewall, could be a next generation antivirus, something like that. And then you have a workaround. Again, workarounds are very important because a workaround you can apply without the patch itself. So you can actually deploy a countermeasure, maybe a registry key, or you want to modify a service, and that effectively stops the vulnerability from being able to be exploited. And we need to wrap all of that to your exposure, and that's the only thing we can't tell you. So we can only give you the first 5. Your tool set will give you your exposure. So you put these together, and hopefully we will come up with a priority for you. Now, if you don't necessarily have a patching strategy already, maybe this is something that you're used to deploying criticals only. Once again, Pete has been doing a lot of research for us and has actually come up with a patching strategy that we feel is actually quite an excellent start point. So Pete, maybe you'd like to let us know what you've been working on.
Oh, thanks very much, Rob. Yeah, I hope I can live up to that introduction. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that the aim of most security teams is to remediate all vulnerabilities. Now, in other words, what I mean is that no devices in your estate have any vulnerabilities and therefore require any patches. Now, having said that, a wise approach to get towards this nirvana is to gradually build up the patches in your baseline deployment, potentially starting with the most important patches for you. So that could be going on the CVSS score or the vendor severity or anything that you feel is particularly important. Obviously, you're working your way towards a deployment of all patches, but it's wise not to necessarily do that all in one go. In other words, opening a floodgate of patches into your estate. So how could you possibly choose the patches which you want to start the process with? Well, as I said, over the last 2 months, I've been talking about the CVSS score, and that is one possible way of selecting patches for your deployment. The vendor score being another way, or even possibly a third way, is to, if your toolset will allow you to do this, would be to use both the vendor and the CVSS score to combine them two together to create a collection of patches that you wish to at least start your deployment with. Then over a period of weeks or even months, you gradually manipulate the way that the tool is automatically collecting those patches, reducing the scores, thus adding more patches to your baseline. Okay, can you show the next slide, Rob? Okay, so in this slide, you can see here that with a policy or task-based toolset, we can break the process down into 3 subsections. The devices that you wish to actually target, the patches which you wish to deploy, and the timing of that deployment. Now, of course, you can have multiple patch deployments set up along with automatic methods of selecting both the patches and the devices which you're targeting. So you can have these processes running in parallel. The multiple process could potentially give you a higher success rate because in that way you could be targeting devices when they're much more likely to be switched on. Obviously, laptops and desktops you may wish to target during the day, but servers, well, you may as well target those at nighttime when they're really effectively not doing an awful lot, I would hope. That way, minimizing the impact on what that server is actually trying to provide, be that SQL or a web server or something like that. And obviously, I've mentioned the device selection based on hardware or software criteria. That could be an automatic method of gathering the patches together, gathering the devices together for which you wish to target. And again, an automatic patch selection based on criteria that you define within your console. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so I've put together just an idea here of some patch deployment strategies. This first one being for end user devices. Now this could be modified or changed. It just gives you an idea of the flexibility that you may wish to sort of look at with your tool in order to create these multiple deployment strategies. So you can see here that the devices being targeted, Within the tool that I'm using, I've decided to create a method of finding all the Windows non-server devices, thus excluding the servers. The devices must not be in a pending reboot state. And now again, if that's brought back as part of the inventory data, that can be very important. The reason for looking at the reboot state of a device is that generally Microsoft patches these days will refuse to install if the device is in a pending reboot state. Now that's done to both protect the patch and protect the device. Now, ironically, deploying patches to devices is quite often the catalyst for setting that reboot flag. So it is a catch-22 situation. What you may wish to do is have a task running a day before you're due to do your patch deployment to find those devices that are in a pending reboot state and get them rebooted, maybe with some end user control, to get them into a fit state, ready for the following day's patch deployment. On top of that as well, if the tool set allows you to do this, you may as well only target devices where the tool is indicating that the device actually requires at least one of the patches which you're about to deploy. If the device is fully patched, then there's no point in it being included in the task. Clearly, it wouldn't get any patches anyway, but with a dynamic device selection, devices can drop in and out of each patching session based on these criteria. Moving on, the patches which you wish to deploy, and again, this is entirely down to you to pick and choose here, but I've gone for patches that must have a CVSS score of 7 or higher. Now that's actually classed in a descriptive term in CVSS as high or critical. So that's all the way up to 10, obviously 9 to 10 being critical. In addition to option 1, the patches could have a vendor score of high or critical. The two quite often line up with the vendor and the CVSS, but not necessarily all the time. In this way, we're catching both scoring systems here. Also, we could include the fact that the patch must not be superseded by a newer patch. Now, this really quite often applies to Microsoft patches. They will supersede an old patch with a newer patch. If you deploy the new patch, then the device, the vulnerabilities have been fixed for both the older patch and the new patch. If you deployed the old patch, the device can still be vulnerable to the newer patch. And obviously, in order to create efficiency, we may as well just deploy the latest patch. Again, in my fictitious end user deployment, we're only going to include Microsoft patches at this point in time. So the patches must have a vendor of Microsoft. Okay. And along with that, we may wish to even include a separate container of patches, which we could call ad hoc patches or something like that, which don't conform to points 1 to 4 above, but they are patches which you wish to deploy. So they could be Java, Chrome, Flash. Hopefully that would keep John happy, as he as indicating the third-party patches are very important. You could pick and choose those, not based on not having an automatic process, but you just drop them into a folder and they get deployed along with the Microsoft patches, which have been picked using the criteria. Now, obviously, the third thing which we need to do to create a task, and possibly the frequency of repeating that task, is to choose when we wish to actually create that deployment, and also whether we want to allow those devices to run that task outside that time of deployment. So you can see here we're deploying on Thursday and Friday at 2 p.m. we start the task off. If a device misses that task but comes online on Saturday, it will see that it's missed the task and it will pick that up and run that task, download and install the patches that are relevant to it. Okay, next slide please, Rob. Okay, so finally here, again, just an example of maybe a server patch deployment with some subtle differences to the previous methodology. So in this case, we're looking for devices that are Windows-based servers only. If the device is pending a reboot, if your tool set allows it, maybe we'll reboot that device before we start to proceed with the actual patch deployment. Get that device in a fit state to be rebooted. And with servers, it may well be worth rebooting those devices anyway to get rid of memory leaks, software that's been running on those devices for maybe a week, that type of thing, can potentially have leaks in there. If we can get the device rebooted, it's in a clean, fit state to receive the patches, possibly followed by a reboot at the end of this task. Again, patch scan indicates that at least one of the patches in the patch criteria is required, otherwise we may not wish to target those devices. The patches which we wish to deploy, again, I've just picked these numbers, a CVSS score of 8.9 or higher, so in this case that's critical patches only. In addition to that option, we can include vendor patches if the vendor has scored that patch as critical. Moving on to the third point, the patch must not be superseded by a new patch. Again, that's for the same criteria that I mentioned earlier, or the same reasons. Fourth point, we're only going to include Microsoft patches based on criteria 1, 2, and 3. And again, the fifth point, we could include third-party patches that we've put into a specific container that we just want deployed anyway. Now, a subtle difference here between the timing of end user patches and server patches could be that your patch deployment has a start time and actually has an end time. So you can see here the patching window closes at 7 a.m. Devices are not allowed to continue downloading and installing patches after 7 a.m. Now, for servers, there could be a valid reason for that. Let's say we're deploying a large number of patches to a server. We start at 10 o'clock, at 7 a.m. it's still installing patches. Well, we may need that server to stop doing that. We can't be using the CPU and memory to be installing patches during office hours. Let's say office hours start at 7 a.m. Now, that may mean that we didn't get all of those patches down to that device in that patching session. That's not really the end of the world. We're playing the long game here. The next time that session opens up, those remaining patches get installed on that device, but the server is allowed to perform its day-to-day function. We haven't spilled over into the office hours, pushing patches down to that device. So it's just some ideas there, really, that you can think about, assuming that your tool set allows you to have that flexibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's actually excellent. Thank you, Pete. That's really excellent. In fact, the thing that I've just been making some notes here is that I think one of the biggest challenges. One of the biggest challenges you might have is actually having the ability to stop patching before it hits the business hours, and that might take some work, some research into the tool set that you're using. If that is an essential part of your mechanism, there are tool sets that can stop. But I think that's one of the most important things I'm taking away, along with the flexibility of your CVSS score. I really feel that that's an exceptional mechanism for prioritizing patches. But Pete, thank you very much indeed for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Patch Tuesday. So I'm not putting them here in the slide. You actually have access to them by going to our website. So Syxsense.com. If you go to that, I'll show you what it looks like. So here we've got our news page. So our news page has a link directly for Patch Tuesday, but on our news page we have all of our articles. You don't need to subscribe or have a username and a password to access any of this material. Every time we find, both in Microsoft and non-Microsoft operating systems, vulnerabilities, 0 days, weaponized threats, they are all uploaded here. So you can see we have Patch Tuesday articles, we have out-of-band articles, we also have vulnerability articles that affect the operating system outside of patch management, such as firewalls and user permissions, things like that. Now, to see the Patch Tuesday article, you simply click here to read more. And as I mentioned, if you want further help, you can talk to our technical people down here, the technical reps. They're available to chat to, or if you want to start a trial of our software, you can click here. More importantly, so that you don't have to come to the website each and every month, you can fill in your your name and email, and we will send you a link to this article every time Patch Tuesday and other news pops up. Really think this is important. So let's talk about the 123 vulnerabilities that were fixed in yesterday's Patch Tuesday. So there was a serious DNS vulnerability that we're going to talk about as well in this one. So it's right at the top. But before we do, we'll just break it down. So this is another month with over 120 updates that were released. What's interesting is that there were 18 criticals. That's actually up since last month. So last month there weren't 18 criticals, there were only 16, and the remaining 105 are marked important. And for definite, with this cadence, next month Microsoft will have released more would have resolved more vulnerabilities than the entire of 2019 combined. That's just crazy. It's only August. Okay, so if you're still using Windows 7, and a lot of our clients are still using Windows 7, you will want to be aware of the Windows 7 vulnerabilities in this baseline or in this release. There are 35 vulnerabilities that are fixed. 6 of them are critical, 29 are important, and in particular, one of them is very bad, which is the remote desktop client vulnerability, which I'm going to talk about in a second. You will also have seen there was a hijacking vulnerability that was released on Friday of last week for OneDrive. We're going to talk about that one as well. So some patches of interest that I'm bringing to your attention, ending in 1350. So these are the CVEs I mentioned. So if you're in your tool set, simply search for that CVE and you'll find the patches that will resolve that particular vulnerability. This one is a CVSS score of 10. The reason why it's right at the top is because I don't remember for the last few months we've ever had a CVSS score of 10, especially something that is extremely likely to be used. Now, at the moment, it's not public aware or weaponized. It's not public aware or weaponized, but there is a countermeasure. So as I mentioned before, the only thing you can do apart from deploying a patch is deploy a countermeasure. This countermeasure is actually a registry key to resolve this DNS issue. But if you read the material, if you read the article that's linked to this patch, you will actually see that Microsoft recommends that you remove the registry after you've installed the patch. So don't leave the registry key there if you are patching this vulnerability. Only use it as a countermeasure until you can get the patch deployed. The next one is CVE 1463. That's a media streaming vulnerability. And actually, on the face of it, it doesn't look like it should belong. It doesn't have a serious CVSS. It doesn't have a serious severity. But when you read the description of what this is potentially going to impact, you'll understand why, through our experience, we're recommending this one. So this particular vulnerability is affecting the media streaming on Windows 10. And Windows streaming on Windows 10 is being used more and more as users are actually taking their desktops home. Now, it's an elevation of privilege vulnerability. And if you are streaming your videos with Microsoft Stream or Yammer, which is the chat software, potentially simply watching one of those videos could allow your system to be infected. So we think that that's actually a pretty important one to prioritize. Although from our experience, we're saying it's important, only it doesn't actually look like it is if you compare the CVSS and the vendor severity. The next one we talked about is 1374. 1374 is a remote desktop client vulnerability. Now, a lot of organizations are still using remote desktop. We know this. Now, this particular vulnerability has a CVSS score of 7.5, and it is critical. Now, because of its use, it should be prioritized. If you're still using remote desktop, the danger for this one is that although it does require a pretty sophisticated sequence of events to take place in order to expose the vulnerability. So you may need to be having physical access to the network. You may need to have a specific type of access to the system. It doesn't require any privileges. So if you can physically get to the devices, you can expose this remote desktop vulnerability and have access to that system and deliver payloads, infect with ransomware, or perform data theft. So for that purpose, it is one of our top 4 for today. And the last one, CVE 1465. Now, Microsoft released this hijacking vulnerability upgrade on Friday, so version 20. And today, just a few days later, they've gone and patched it with another vulnerability. They patched another vulnerability, and we don't like the fact this has happened so soon. So we feel that based on its CVSS score and its vendor severity, and the fact that a actively exploited hijacking vulnerability was found just last month, that this one should be on your top 4. And John, I know you've also got a patch of a vulnerability of interest as well. Would you like to let us know which one that is? And I'll show that on the screen.
Yeah, CVE 2020-1424. This is for an elevation of privilege vulnerability.
I see.
Yeah, perfect. So this exists when the Windows Update stack fails to properly handle objects in memory. As Microsoft has stated, an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could run arbitrary code in kernel mode and then install programs, alter, delete data, or create new accounts with full user rights. So to exploit this vulnerability, an attacker would first have to successfully log onto the system and then run their specially crafted application to take control of said affected system.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also like to provide a little bit on the Windows or the servicing stack updates as well, if that's okay. Even though this is a particular vulnerability, servicing stack updates do also get delivered regularly. And I just want to highlight that these are interesting because many in the industry are not aware of what the servicing stack updates actually entail. The updates provide fixes to the component that actually installs Windows updates. It contains they call it component-based servicing stack, or CBS, which is a key underlying component for several elements of Windows deployment, like DISM, SFC, changing Windows features and roles, repairing components. The servicing stack updates improve the reliability, though, of the update process to mitigate potential issues while installing the latest quality updates, feature updates as well specifically. So the major risk of skipping these updates is that, well, simply you won't be able to install the latest updates in the sequence, including the Windows feature updates themselves, which, as we know, are upgrades to Windows 10. They're like the successor to service packs, essentially, which allow Windows to have an extended life cycle. And so these are very different from cumulative updates because they must be, actually, since they're critical as kind of a catalyst to the process. They're critical to modify the component that in turn installs the Windows updates, again, such as cumulatives, such as feature updates. Microsoft does strongly recommend to install the latest servicing stack updates as well for the operating system before installing anything else. And again, cumulatives and feature updates included. But I did also want to note, since we focus on vulnerabilities and severity as well, that they typically don't give servicing stack updates a severity rating. So even though we want to prioritize based on security rating, these should still be prioritized separately as prerequisites, since again, each month, new batches of updates get released. These should also be prioritized when they are rolled out.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you. Were there any more? Was that that servicing stack your chosen patch of interest?
That's the highlight for this month. At the very top, you already highlighted one that I've seen across the industry mentioned multiple times, and that would be for the 2020-1350 DNS server issue. And so that's causing a lot of departments to scatter and get that update resolved as soon as possible, especially since it's for servers, which of course do have their own channel, their own process alone, different from patching workstations. It's a server-related update.
Yeah. That's brilliant, John. Thank you very much. Okay, so it's interesting that you mentioned the servicing stack, because actually the servicing stack, I know, I've been doing a little bit of research from the last webinar we did. You can think of the servicing stack as the foundation for Windows 10. But what's interesting is the servicing stack exists as well for Windows 7. So if you still are Windows 7, you do need to ensure your servicing stack is healthy, because your servicing stack and then your updates are actually installed onto that service stack. So if that service stack isn't healthy, isn't solid, your foundation for future patch management or feature updates potentially will actually be reduced. And I just want to highlight, John, for a second, that the table here is actually taken from the official Microsoft site. So if you actually Google the lifecycle fact sheet on the Microsoft support site, you'll actually see this is the roadmap for the Windows 10 feature update. And there are a few, as you can see, that are coming up for end of life fairly soon.
The particular versions that you have there, and it's also of noting as well as we have in the past, that Microsoft does assign different life cycles for these versions of Windows 10 based on the edition, based on the license that has been purchased. Overall, we consider them consumer or business or organizational versions, and they typically do get a life cycle. Microsoft is, we've noticed that there's a tendency for them to standardize the spring releases, but the fall releases typically are going to be broken into 18 months versus 30 months. But since the current climate, a lot of organizations, again, sending devices home, a few versions to highlight there, the ones that you have with asterisks in the table. November 10th for 1809 has actually been extended, although it was already pretty much set to expire. I think now being July, it would have been around March or April. And then for the organizational version for 1709, that's also been extended to later on in the year, but that date is coming up fast. So for any organizations that may be using, doesn't matter, they can be still using consumer or the business versions, they should be prioritized because, as we see, there are clearly newer versions out there, which will provide not only security fixes, but also new features for efficiency, productivity.
Right, yeah, exactly. And actually, I'd love to do a slide. I'd actually love to hear some feedback if you understand the importance of the feature update roadmap. So if you guys, if any of the if anyone watching would like more info on the feature update, it is a fascinating process of Windows 10 because not many realize that you can't just stay on the same feature update forever. Eventually your patches that Microsoft release will stop at that feature update level. And although Microsoft Patch Tuesday will keep going and you may still be on Windows 10, your patches will stop if you don't update your feature update. It's so essential that if you haven't already adopted a process for upgrading to the next feature update version, that you do so.
Oh, Rob, I've just got something to add to that. Yeah. I think it can, in fact, be even a little bit worse, can't it? In that patches can install, and then on the reboot of that device, they'll actually roll back, which clearly isn't an ideal situation for any device to be in. And installing and uninstalling patches is a potential there for something to go wrong with that device at the end of the day.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, uninstalling an update, I've had a lot of history. One of my first roles, the first job I ever did was deploying Windows NT Service Pack 5, Windows NT 4 Service Pack 5, and it blew up and the rollback was hideous. And I remember from those days that uninstalling an update can be very dangerous. Actually, one of my golden rules when we are talking about a strategy for a patch management is you must inspect what the uninstall procedure looks like. Is there even an uninstall procedure for the patch? Because if there isn't, you need to take your testing to the next level.
Very true.
Thank you for that, Pete. And John, you've got some LTSC and LTSB main support as well here. This is for the extended support for these Windows 10 systems, right?
Yeah, so even though there is a separate edition for Windows 10 standard license, which again does follow the same procedure as consumer versions, it just has a slightly longer life cycle. Long-term service channels or service branch can also be utilized. They do, as we see, get a much longer extended support date. So patches will still come down. It's usually in a smaller quantity because, of course, the overall purpose is to reduce the amount of changes that are taking place to these machines. There are some newer versions as well. So even though long-term service branch has been around since 2015, the same with the 1607 release, there's also one for, I believe it's 1903 or 1909 as well. They do give again a longer life cycle. as we see from the chart, mainstream support for the latest version all the way to 2024. So you just really have to manage, again, small amount of quality updates for these, but then extended support all the way nearly to 2030 for the latest version.
That's a long time. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for that, John. Now, I see we've got about 15 minutes left, and I know we have a couple of questions actually that I see come through. So we've got, as requested, guys, we've actually got a couple of slides on Mac and Linux. Unfortunately, Mac and Linux isn't my specialist area, but John, I know you've got a lot of experience with these operating systems. Maybe you could highlight a few for us.
Yeah, absolutely. The latest release for Mac, especially for the latest OS version, nothing too, really too widespread for most Mac customers. The latest supplemental update, for example, really only applied to MacBook, is for a specific version of the chassis type as well. So you typically won't see this on every device, only for a specific model. But the same goes for other versions of the earlier operating system. So you can still be on High Sierra, as I see from your chart as well, Mojave. They should still be prioritized. So even though Mac typically doesn't see as many changes, the changes typically come down in a much more solid format, not a huge batch of updates to be deployed one by one. Prioritize them. If they are available, they need to be deployed still. Do take into account still change management, test on a few machines, make sure that it works for the organization, and then move on to the next set, which again, as I mentioned in the past, it is a bit of a level of a balance, I should say, between effectiveness and efficiency. Focus on making it effective first, test it, make sure that it'll work for everyone else, and then worry about how quick it's going to take when you get into production.
And I see Safari there. Is that that must be the browser for that, right? So that would probably be
browser updates.
Very, very popular on macOS to get that one patched. I see it's actually from May, but these CVSS scores are really high, as you can see. So I think if you haven't already, then you should really be prioritizing those ones. We have a few red hats as well.
Yeah, a few other updates, of course. These get rolled out regularly for all Linux variants, Red Hat, Ubuntu, Oracle, CentOS. Anytime the packages are available, make sure it'll work, because every package is a little bit different. There are certain packages and updates for certain services. So maybe not every package is important. You can technically consider those optional, but if they do have a score, they should still be prioritized. Red Hat typically gets these updates, very frequently. I think you have a few more versions, additional slides as well.
Yep.
SUSE, definitely. Same with the Windows OS updates that I mentioned earlier for third-party patches, Mozilla, Firefox. Well, those do apply technically to Linux too. So they should also be prioritized, because they're rolled out for one OS, they're rolled out for the other.
Just before we go to the next slide, the one thing I noticed when we were looking when I was looking at these slides is that a lot of these vendors are using different terminologies for their severities. So some of them are calling it important, moderate, critical, high. I suppose that would almost make the CVSS almost more important to make clarity when there is so many different types of severity used across these Linux operating systems. I mean, they're all Linux, but they all are a little bit different, I imagine. And I suppose the only commonality here is the CVSS, because it's the independent score. And some of these again look really high.
Yeah, it's a great point. It goes back to your recommendations when it comes down to looking at a vulnerability and assessing how important it is. You really should be normalizing those scores, because every vendor can have a different outlook. Nothing bad towards any vendor, but they could clearly be biased because they are packages that they are introducing for their own system. So it is very important to diversify that knowledge, look at common vulnerability security scores. Well, the keyword common, that it is going to be applied and rated at the same scale for every other vendor. That's a good point.
Yeah, I see these ones are mediums, so something we haven't seen before since Microsoft. So yeah, fascinating, brilliant. Okay.
I would also like to highlight some Oracle updates as well.
Oh yes.
Oracle does release updates as well every quarter. They did have a critical release just yesterday as well for various Oracle products. So as well, if you have Oracle Enterprise Linux, you should definitely be prioritizing that, especially if you are using multiple Oracle services within the same environment. You got a huge batch of updates waiting for you.
Oh, wow. That's brilliant, John. Thank you. And Pete, that's brilliant feedback. What we would love, though, is we'd love to know, have we chosen the right Linux and have we chosen the right Linux operating systems that you want us to talk about? Maybe you don't want us to talk about Linux on the Patch Tuesday webinar, and maybe you want us to have a dedicated webinar, maybe 30 minutes for those operating systems, specifically for them alone. Let us know either in the comments, in the chat, on the Facebook. We really do value your feedback here. We try to make this for you, and as long as you keep joining, we'll keep adding this great content. So thank you very much, Heidi.
Great. Hi, Rob. Yes, we do have several questions, but there's still time. If people have additional questions, please feel free to continue to ask them. And if we don't get to yours with the panelists, we'll definitely reach back out to you and answer it to you privately. The first one I have is, do you think that using the vendor score is more or less reliable than the CVSS score?
Shall I go for that, seeing as I'm always talking about the CVSS?
Yes, please, Pete. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess you probably know my answer. Well, personally, I would go for the CVSS score over the vendor score. One of the reasons being that if you can imagine you're a vendor of an application, you may not wish to actually advertise the fact that that application has got a huge gaping critical vulnerability. It's not really ideal for you to be shouting about that about your own product. So you may try and play that down. Whereas obviously CVSS score, independent from the vendor, they don't care who the vendor is, they will score it on their set of metrics. Now, having said that, if you have to choose one or the other, yes, go for CVSS. If you don't have that available in your tool set, then you don't really have much choice but to go for the vendor severity. And if your tool set allows you to choose both in some automatic fashion, then great. By all means, go for both sets of scoring systems when picking and choosing patches. Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Pete.
Great, thanks. Another question is there ever a time when you would consider deploying a superseded patch?
I can cover that. Overall,
sorry,
really.
Sorry, John. Do you want to explain what that is? Because we know what a superseded patch is, but maybe just start it by explaining what.
I think I mentioned them, didn't I? But yeah, I'm sure John can.
Okay.
Cover that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I say the saying all the time, and it's sounds dumb, but updates. So when they come down in that particular sequence, you can clearly have updates that are going to be somewhat obsolete. Sometimes updates get put into a partial state, sometimes they're marked as fully obsolete. So when it comes to supersedance, a superseded patch is again an older patch. Is there a time when you consider deploying a superseded patch? In some cases, when it comes to potentially what I was mentioning earlier, like a servicing stack update, if there is a particular baseline you'd like to get up to that would involve an older servicing stack update, that could make sense, but you can also deploy the latest one, and of course you would be able to bring yourself up to a much later baseline, not an old baseline. So there are some reasons in which, yes, it could resolve a vulnerability, but why not just go with the latest update within that particular sequence? You can call it a vulnerability chain, you can call it the vulnerability sequence itself. In some cases, like with products, even with third-party patches specifically, products like Java, certain applications for certain departments may require a certain version, otherwise that software may not work. So with Java specifically, it may not always be possible to go to the latest version, like it would with an OS update, so you may need to go to an earlier version, and that would make sense to deploy a superseded patch, which again, for products like that would be an older version.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, the next one is, how do you communicate patching to senior leaders?
I think I might answer this one. The risk to an environment has got to be based on potentially those six factors that we mentioned. Reporting is key. Having clear and concise reporting for company leadership. When we produce reports, or when I like to see reports of our own systems, I like to see that there is a routine deployment of patches, and that comes through a reporting of some kind, whether that report is a timeline, so you have a timeline that represents over time the patches that Microsoft or Linux or third parties are releasing versus the number of machines in the console or in the environment rather, and then the deployment of the patches to remediate those vulnerabilities. Because leadership, from my experience, they want to see that you have a routine, that you are deploying patches, that you are deploying patches to resolve vulnerabilities, and actually how much of the estate broken down by the severities makes it even easier to show success. So if you show that there are no critical vulnerabilities or highs or mediums, and like Pete mentioned, you're changing the CVSS score to a lower number, so anything above that number automatically gets included, it shows you have a progression. So from my experience, that's how I would answer that. It'd all be about the reporting to leadership, clear and concise, and with a timeline.
Very nice, thank you. Next question, is it a good idea to always deploy Microsoft patches as soon as they are released?
I think I'll go for that one, soon as I was talking about deployment strategies. It's a good question, and it may be slightly controversial, really, but there is a school of thought that would suggest that it's not always wise to be deploying Microsoft patches literally as soon as they're released. Now, you must balance that out, obviously, against the fact that you don't want to be waiting for weeks and months before deploying those patches. But let's face it, there is a risk to devices whilst deploying patches, and there is a risk to devices for not deploying those patches. I'd like to think the risk of deploying is a lot less than not deploying. Now, if your toolset will allow you to select patches based on a publication date, for example, so let's say patches that are less than 10 days old, and it can automatically collect those patches for you, and let's say we're just talking about Microsoft here, and then it will automatically deploy those patches to a smaller test group of devices that could be end user devices or at least real world devices, maybe to the IT department, that type of thing. That would give you, in this example, 10 days worth of grace where you could find if there's any issues with any of those devices. If there are, you could do a bit of investigation, find out which patch caused that issue, obviously roll that patch back off those devices, hopefully. Put that patch within your tool set into some sort of non-deployable mode, almost like a patch prison. The remaining patches that didn't cause an issue, once they become older than 10 days old, they would again be picked up automatically, assuming your tool set can do this, and then will be deployed to the rest of your estate. Now that way you're giving yourselves 10 days grace. It could be 30 days, 15 days, whatever you choose. So you're not right at the head of the curve where potentially you're the company that's finding the issue with the patch, and equally you're not right at the tail end of the curve where you've left yourself exposed for far too long. Yep. So that would be a nice way of creating small delay in patch deployment, giving yourself some time to catch the odd patch that may cause a problem in your environment, even if it hasn't caused a problem in anyone else's environment. Yep. That's a way I would deal with that.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Pete. Well, I see we've just come to the end of our time today. I would like to say thank you again to everybody that's joined us today. You'll be able to get a copy of this recording very shortly. If you'd like to discuss with us or like to talk to us about a trial, or if you'd like to have a patching strategy conversation with us, we'd be more than welcome to send a chat via the website or the Facebook page. And we really hope that you have a great weekend, great week, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Goodbye.